Welcome to Just the Stats
Powered by
NFL, the show that
Riverside
covers
FM.
the NFL statistical leaders from the all time greats to the current players leading the NFL. I am Ernie Jennings, your host. So, we are going to stick to the stats and leave the gossip to the multitude of other shows that cover the NFL. Today, we're going to dive in again into the all time best single game leaders. This will be the second of two episodes that cover these leaders. In this episode, we're going to cover the wide receivers, scoring, and defense. But if you want to hear about the leading quarterbacks and running backs, you can go back to part one of our coverage. So we're going to find out how many current players appear on the list of all-time greats in a single game. And here we go. Let's get started with just the stats, NFL. So we're going to start with receivers and receptions in a single game. There's only two players in NFL history who have had 20 or more receptions in a game, and that is Brandon Marshall and Terrell Owens. Brandon Marshall in 2009 against the Indianapolis Colts, while he was playing for the Denver Broncos, Marshall set the all-time NFL single-game reception record when he caught 21 passes out of 28 targets. 28 targets. That's incredible. And that was for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. Despite that, the Denver Broncos ended up losing 28-16 in that game. The other one that did it was Terrell Owens for San Francisco 49ers against the Chicago Bears on December 17th, 2020. He had 20 receptions on 22 targets, so only 2 passes sent his way that he didn't catch, and he had 283 yards in a game where the 49ers beat Chicago Bears 17-0. Terrell Owens had a touchdown in that game. Third is Tom Fears for the Los Angeles Rams in a game against the Green Bay Packers. He held the record of 18 receptions, which he did on December 3rd of 1950. Tom Fears had 18 receptions for 189 yards and 2 touchdowns. He was the first person, like I said, to reach 18 catches in a game, which propelled the Los Angeles Rams a win over Green Bay Packers by 51-14. Brandon Marshall had 18 receptions in 2008. So 1 year later, in 2009, he's going to break his own personal record and set the all-time record, jumping from 18 receptions to 21. Incredible player at the time. And then there's only 2 other players that had 18 receptions. There's only 6 players that have 18 or more receptions in a season. The other ones, and this is Jason Witten for the Dallas Cowboys, he holds the record for tight ends as far as receptions in a game. He had 18 as well against the New York Giants in 2012. And despite his 18 receptions, the Cowboys lost to the Giants 29-24. And then the final player was Keenan Allen. And Keenan Allen is the most current player to have 18. Keenan Allen had 18 receptions for the Los Angeles Chargers against the Minnesota Vikings in September of 2023. And he did that on 20 targets. He racked up 215 yards. He had 10 first downs, leading the Chargers to a win over the Minnesota Vikings by a score of 28-24. What's interesting about him is that this season, coming into the 2025 season, he's almost talked up as if he's washed up. And so it'll be interesting to see how well he plays with the kind of talk about him, considering that this 18 receptions was only a couple years ago. So we'll see how his season goes. I had a couple of players here that I was listing with 16 receptions or 17 receptions. And the first one here is Antonio Brown, had 17 receptions in 2015. And then he turned around and did it again in December of 2015. He had 16. So he had 16 receptions and 17 receptions in the same season. Another one is Keenan Allen, who, like I said, is on the list with 18, one of the only 6 players with 18 or more. But he had 16 receptions in 2020. So that's incredible. Of course, Brandon Marshall going from 18 receptions to 21 is also amazing. And then one other player I mentioned just because being a Jaguar fan, I wanted to, is Keenan McCardell had 16 receptions against the St. Louis Rams in 1996 in a game that the Jaguars won 30-28 in overtime. He had 16 catches, 232 yards that night. So that's an impressive game for him. So let's look at last season, 2024 season. Who had the most receptions in a game and how many was it? Well, there were 4 players who had 14, quite a ways away from the record of 21. And Jamar Chase, Travis Kelce, Cooper Kupp, and Amon-Ra St. Brown all had 14 receptions in a game. That's the best you see. A few players, again, 4 more players with 13 and then several with 12. But really no one who came close. And in fact, Jamar Chase had 18 targets for his 14 receptions. So, first of all, you've got to have at least enough targets to break a record. But, 14 is nothing to sneeze at, but it's quite a ways from the single game record. Let's look at receiving yards and who led the league in receiving yards all time as well as in 2024. Well, the record is held by Flipper Anderson of the Los Angeles Rams, who had 336 yards against the New Orleans Saints on November 26, 1989. That's a game the Rams won 20-17. It was an overtime game, which might have factored in, of course, to his 336 yards, as it did because he had the 30-yard winning touchdown catch. And what's funny about that, if you ever saw the game or if you look it up, he caught the pass and he just kept on running right through the tunnel into the locker room. For that game, he was named the NFC Offensive Player of the Year. Second to him was Calvin Johnson for the Detroit Lions, who had 329 yards. Now, this is in a non-overtime game, so basically, if you want to say he has the record for games that were not overtime, he had 329 yards on 14 receptions. That included an 87-yard touchdown or a run and a 54-yard run. So pretty impressive. He had a touchdown as well in that game. So that was Calvin Johnson setting the regulation game mark for yards in a single game of 329. In that game, Stafford, who was quarterback for the Lions at the time, completed 33 passes for 488 yards, so close to one of his 500-yard games. Third on the list is Stephon Page with 309 yards. He played for the Kansas City Chiefs, and in 1985 against the San Diego Chargers, his team won the game 38-34. Stephon Page is interesting because he was undrafted out of Fresno State. And here he is showing up as one of the all-time leaders in single game yardage. He's the one that initially broke Jim Benton's record of 303 yards. So he has that distinction as holding the record from 1985 until 1989. So not really that long, 4 years almost before Flipper Anderson broke it. Calvin Johnson almost broke Flipper Anderson's record, but not quite. Missed it by 7 yards. But Stephon Page broke the record held by Jim Benton. Jim Benton played for the Cleveland Rams back in 1945 when he set the record against the Detroit Lions. The Rams were the Cleveland Rams until 1946 when they moved out of the city, because you had the Cleveland Browns and the Cleveland Rams, and the Cleveland Rams just couldn't compete monetarily against the Browns, so they bailed to Los Angeles for greener pastures. Just so happens, though, that the year when Jim Benton had those 303 yards in one game was the same year that the Cleveland Rams won the NFL championship. So you win the NFL championship and you're still not the most popular team in Cleveland, which is one of the reasons they left. This was in a game where, like I said, the Rams won 28-21 over the Lions. And in that game, Bob Waterfield was the quarterback, throwing for 329 yards, which means 303 of them went to Jim Benton and only 26 yards went to the rest of the team. And that was actually only one other receiver caught 2 passes for 26 yards. The rest were all to Jim Benton. You would have thought the defense would have noticed that and focused mostly on Jim Benton, but obviously they didn't. And actually, Jim Benton only caught 10 passes for those 303 yards. So, he's averaging 30 yards a reception. In 1950, you had Cloyce Box for the Detroit Lions against the Baltimore Colts. In a game, he had 302 yards. Lions won that game 45-21. That was the Lions single game record until Calvin Johnson came around in 2013 and broke it. So Cloyce Box held the Detroit Lions record for 63 years before Calvin Johnson broke it. Only 6 players have had 300 or more yards in a single game as far as receiving goes. The last one was Julio Jones. He's the last player to do it. And the most recent one, he did it in 2016. He had 300 yards playing for the Atlanta Falcons against the Carolina Panthers, which the Falcons won 48-33. He had 12 catches for 300 yards, and he had a touchdown as well. Impressive game. This was a game where Matt Ryan had 503 yards passing. So you had his 503 and 300 yards by the receiver. That's quite an incredible amount of yardage. One other player I want to mention who comes in 7th. He was next on the list behind Julio Jones was Jimmy Smith for the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had 291 yards, which is the Jaguars' record for single game yardage. That was September 10th, 2000 against the Baltimore Ravens. And despite that, the Ravens ended up winning 39-36. Smith had 15 catches for 291 yards and 3 touchdowns, but still they could not win that game. Let's look at the 2024 season and see what kind of yardage the people had for 2024. Jamar Chase had 264 yards in his game against Baltimore. It was a loss, 35-34. That was a game on November 7th. But 264 yards. Jerry Jeudy had 235 yards in a game against the Cleveland, which also happened to be a loss, 41-32. Those are the only 2 players last year who had more than 200 yards in receiving. So it really wasn't a big year as far as receiving yardage went compared to some other years. Those are the top 2. Active players on the list of all-time yardage in a single game. Tyreek Hill is the current leader with 269 yards. He did that in 2020 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Jamar Chase, very impressive. He's on here twice. He did it in 2022, and then he did it in 2024. In a game against Kansas City Chiefs, he had 266 yards. And then that was in 2022. And then in 2024, again, like I said, just last year against the Baltimore Ravens, he had 264. Amari Cooper is the only other player on this list in the top 40. Amari Cooper in 2023, just a couple of years ago, playing for Cleveland against the Houston Texans, had 265 yards. I'm not sure what his status is right now, how well he's going to play. He seems to have dropped off quite a bit since that point. All right, those are the leading receivers in yardage in a single game. Let's look at touchdowns. So you have 3 players who have had 5 touchdowns receptions in a single game. Jerry Rice, Kellen Winslow, and Bob Shaw. Bob Shaw set the record in 1950 for the Chicago Cardinals. October 2nd in 1950, in a game against the Baltimore Colts, Bob Shaw had 5 touchdowns. The Cardinals won that game 55-13. He only had 8 catches, so 5 of them were for touchdowns. That's impressive. It took 31 years before it was even tied, and that was by Kellen Winslow playing for the San Diego Chargers against the Oakland Raiders in November 22nd, 1991. He had 5 TDs. He had 13 targets. He caught 5 for touchdowns in a game where he had 144 yards, and it was a win for the Chargers, 55-21. And then Jerry Rice matched that 9 years later, 1990, against the Atlanta Falcons in a game where he had 13 receptions for 225 yards. And it was a romp by San Francisco over the Atlanta Falcons of 41-14. This came in a year for Jerry Rice where he was a Triple Crown winner for that season. He led the league in receptions, yards, and TDs as far as receiving goes. So only 3 players have had 5, and no one's ever been able to top it. So 1950, you had 5, and it's still to this day standing 75 years later. We'll see if this coming season somebody can catch it. This last year in 2024, you had 4 players who had 3 touchdown receptions in a game. Jamar Chase again. You have Juwan Jennings for the San Francisco 49ers. He did that in a loss against the Los Angeles Rams. And then you had Jordan Addison for the Minnesota Vikings in a win over the Atlanta Falcons, 42-41. He had 3 touchdowns, receptions. Then T. Higgins for Cincinnati. So 2 different players for Cincinnati had 3 touchdowns in a single game. And that was against Denver, which they won 30-24. So it was a good game for Cincinnati. So those are the only ones. Then you had several players, quite a few, that had 2. All right, let's shift from receiving to the defense, and let's look at sacks. The all-time leader in sacks is Derek Thomas, who had 7. There's only 6 players. Actually, there's only been 6 times that a player has had 6 or more sacks. And I say it that way because Derek Thomas is the only one on the list twice. He had a game where he had 7 sacks, which was against the Seattle Seahawks in 1990. And despite the fact that the Seahawks won that game 17-16, that was the record set in 1997 sacks. Thomas lamented in that game that the last sack I didn't get is the one I'm going to remember. So Thomas's record now has stood for 35 years. We'll see what happens this year if somebody can catch him. The other players with 6, so there's 5 of those. The last one to do it was Khalil Mack, playing for the Los Angeles Chargers. He had 6 sacks against the Las Vegas Raiders in October 1st of 2023. That's a game the Chargers won 24-17. Got Khalil Mack, the AFC Defensive Player of the Week honors. Prior to that, you had a game in 2017 with Adrian Claiborne for the Atlanta Falcons, had 6 sacks against the Dallas Cowboys, a game which the Falcons won 27-7. In that game, the Cowboys' offensive line was just depleted due to injuries, and Claiborne had 6 sacks and 2 forced fumbles and just dominated. And because of that performance, he also earned a $750,000 contract bonus. Another one 10 years before that, in 2007, was O.C. Umanarioa for the New York Giants. Sorry if I butchered that name. But for the Giants against the Eagles in September 30th of 2007, Giants won that game 16-3. And then we have Derek Thomas again in 1998. who had 6 sacks. So in 1990, 8 years later, he's going to have 6 sacks in a game. What a career he had. That was against the Raiders. So the Raiders, at the time, the Oakland Raiders, were on the wrong end of this twice. The Chiefs won that game 28-8. And then the first person to do it was Fred Dean for the San Francisco 49ers way back in 1980. Derek Thomas, 7 years later, broke the record that was set by Fred Dean. Fred Dean had 6 sacks against the New Orleans Saints in a shutout where the 49ers won 27-0. Those are your only players who had 6 or more sacks. So you can see that it does not happen that often that you see 6 sacks in a single game, which tells you how impressive it is when it does happen. And that's the same when we get to, in just a minute after we look at the 2024 season. But when we look at tackles for loss, you just don't have that many in a game. But this last season, like I said, the record's 7 by Derek Thomas. Last season, 2024, Aiden Hutchinson for Detroit Lions against Tampa Bay had 4.5 sacks. Despite that, the Detroit lost that game, one of their few losses, 20-16, but he had 4.5 sacks in that game. Trey Hendrickson had 4 sacks against the Las Vegas Raiders. He plays for Trey Hendrickson, plays for Cincinnati, and that was a win for the Cincinnati Bengals of 41-24. But he had 4 sacks. Only 2 players that had 4 more sacks. A couple players with 3. One of them again was Trey Hendrickson, so he was up there with 3.5 and 4 sacks. Then you have quite a few with 3 and 2.5, but 4.5 was the tops in sacks last year. When we look at tackles for loss, we have several players who had 6, and that's it. That's the most tackles for loss in a game. Only 6. I mean, it's a lot, but you would think somebody would have broke out for maybe a few more than 6. The most recent player to do it was Joey Bosa. And what's interesting about that is that Joey Bosa, playing for the Los Angeles Chargers, did it against the Buffalo Bills in November 29 of 2020. It's interesting because Joey Bosa was just signed by the Buffalo Bills this last season, this offseason, I should say. Even though right now he's hurt, and so we're going to see how he does. But he's got the record, and this was in a game where, despite his 6 tackles for loss, the Chargers lost the game to the Bills 27-17. He had 6 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 5 quarterback hits, pass deflection, and a fumble recovery. That's an incredible game. And he won the AFC Defensive Player of the Week that week. Prior to him, Aaron Donald had 6 for the Los Angeles Rams against the San Francisco 49ers. The Rams won that game, though, 39-10. Again, it was a game where he just was completely dominant. Aaron Donald was an incredible player. He had 6 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 5 quarterback hits, a forced fumble. Just very impressive game. So like I said, I should have said, actually, there's 6 times a player has had 6 tackles for loss. And just like with sacks with Derek Thomas, you have a player on here twice, and that is J.J. Watt. Twice for Houston had 6 tackles for loss. The last one was against the Kansas City Chiefs in a game the Texans won 27-20 in 2015. He had 6 tackles for loss. He had 9 total stops. He had 2 sacks. 3 years earlier, against the Indianapolis Colts, J.J. Watt in December 16th of 2012 had 6 tackles for loss. In that game, he had 10 total tackles. He had 3 sacks in a victory over the Colts 29-17. That year, he ended up winning Defensive Player of the Year. And then 2009, Andre Carter for the Washington Redskins had 6 tackles for loss. Impressive. The first person to get to 6 tackles for loss was Jeremiah Trotter for the Philadelphia Eagles, who had 6 tackles for loss against the New York Giants on December 30th, 2001, in a game which the Eagles won 24-21. And it was his final game with the Eagles, and he had 6 tackles for loss and had 15 total stops. So quite a career he had with the Eagles. Now, when you look at 2024 season, Danielle Hunter is the only player who had 5 tackles for loss. So 1 tackle away from matching the record of 6. So he had 5, and then you had several players who had 4. But Hunter had his tackles for loss playing again for Houston. Houston seems to have a knack for picking up the right players as far as tackles for loss and sacks go. But this was in a game against Tennessee, and despite his 5 tackles for loss, Tennessee won that game 32-27. That was a shocker, being that Houston was expected to win easily in that game. And Tennessee ended up having a terrible season. Then you had several with 4, like I said. So that is tackles for loss. All right, let's look at interceptions. There are 20 players who have had 4 interceptions in a single game. And unlike these other categories where you only had 6 players who had 6 sacks or 7 sacks and then 6 tackles for loss, despite the fact that there are 20 players who had 4 interceptions, no one's on the list more than once. The most recent player to have done it was D'Angelo Hall for the Washington Redskins in a game against the Chicago Bears on October 24th, 2010. So here we are 15 years later, and it hasn't been accomplished in the last 15 years. The first person to do it was Sammy Baugh for the Washington Redskins. Again, interesting that the last player to do it and the first player to do it were both Washington players. But Sammy Baugh set the record in 1943, November 14th of 1943. Impressive. So again, here's a record that has stood for 82 years. It's been tied, but not exceeded. He had 4 interceptions in a game. The Redskins beat the Lions 42-20. He was the first player, like I said, in NFL history to record 4 interceptions in a single game. Now, what I want to mention him for is because of Travis Hunter, who's been talked about as a two-way player, and I hope he is. As a Jaguar fan, I hope he has the ability to play full-time on offense and defense. Sammy Baugh, not only did he have the 4 interceptions, he also threw 4 touchdown passes, and he was the team's punter. And in that year, 1943, he led the league in passing, punting, and interceptions. So here's a true two-way player, 3 if you count special teams, Sammy Baugh for the Redskins. But this is a player in the 1940s. So we'll be watching Travis Hunter and see how he does this year. Obviously not playing quarterback, but being receiver as well as cornerback. Looking for a big season out of Travis Hunter this coming year. So let's look at 2024 season and interceptions in a single game. Well, you have 17 players who had 2 interceptions in a single game. That's it, just 2. And nobody on the list was a repeat player. So obviously this is a area, as I've mentioned before, where interceptions are just a category that's so hard for defenders in this age of the pass-happy offense and the rules the way they are, which favor the offense in a way that they didn't back in the time when interceptions were much more prevalent. So we'll see if anybody in 2025 can get more than 2 interceptions. And we will be tracking that during the season and talking about it as it happens and if it happens. So that is the different categories that I covered today. I hope you enjoyed it. That wraps up our look at the all-time great single game performers, along with a comparison of those performances against the 2024 season. I hope you enjoyed it. In the next podcast, I will be looking at the leading team performances from a statistical viewpoint. This is going to be a combination of looking at the all-time elite team performances in various categories, as well as a comparison of the teams of 2024. So that should be an interesting podcast. I really appreciate you listening, and I would also appreciate if you subscribe to this podcast. I do have many more podcasts planned throughout the off season, and I'll have one on every individual team and their all-time great players. And then throughout the season, we'll be looking at who has big games and who's moving up the list as far as every kind of all-time great category, all the way from career leaders to individual game leaders and everything in between. So that wraps up this episode of Just the Stats NFL. We are out.